And then, yeah, tonight, welcome to Reading Amateur Brewers. We have our first international speaker. Very pleased to have Dr. Brad Smith joining us. Brad is known as the developer for the extremely popular brewing software BeerSmith. According to his website, he's got over 30 years of brewing experience. He's a frequent blogger, podcaster, writer for Brew Your Own Magazine, as well as home brewing with BeerSmith. So yeah, thank you very much, Brad. Over to you. Thank you. Oh.
Sorry, I had to find the unmute button there, I think. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Jerry, thank you for having me. Okay. I really appreciate you you inviting me. Good evening to you. It's afternoon here in DC, but it's great to come out and talk to you, and great to have this opportunity. I've been doing a couple of these every week, basically, for homebrew clubs all over the country, and I actually did one with a group in Mexico on Tuesday. Anyways, I'm happy to be here, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about designing beer. And this is a presentation I originally developed a couple of years ago for the American Homebrewers Association annual meeting that we have, the Homebrew Con convention that we have every year. And I revised it over the years, put a little more into it. Presentation's about 50 minutes, and I'd be happy to take questions after that if you have any questions at all. But the focus is, as I mentioned, designing beer. And hopefully you can see that, and I'll be sending the slides out, and I'm kind of in the corner there as I talk. If I'm looking down, it's because I'm looking at you guys. I've got a little monitor down here where I can see. So yeah, during the Q&A, I might be looking down, looking at the person asking questions or whatever. Anyway, so yeah, I started brewing in 1987, and things were a little different in 1987. We didn't have the quality of ingredients we have today. We primarily brewed with bread yeast. And we used, we didn't know that the hops were actually green for quite a long time because they were stored openly on a shelf. And they typically arrived, typically whole hops were arrived nice and brown in the homebrew store. And it was hard to make good beer. In fact, the first several beers I made were pretty bad, but I kept doing it anyways, just because, I guess, I thought it was interesting. That all started to change in the early 1990s. So in addition to really horrible ingredients, we did not have a lot of knowledge. We didn't know how to estimate things like bitterness units. We didn't really even know how to estimate original gravity. A lot of the math was not well known at that time. Anyway, so that all started to change in the 90s. And what happened is in the 90s, a discussion started on a whole variety of topics. For example, Glenn Tinseth, who developed the Tinseth equation, which we use to estimate bitterness, started doing his work, his research around then. Rager and Garrett's did similar work on hop bitterness at that time. The craft beer revolution in the United States was in its infancy in the early 90s. And homebrewers started to communicate a lot more and started to develop a lot of practical knowledge on beer brewing, really. So a lot of the equations and so on were developed around that time. An interesting side effect of that, though, a lot of the early discussion happened on the early internet, which, if you recall, the first browser was roughly 1991. By 95, people were starting to use dial-up widely and so on. But one side effect of that too is that the original discussion was dominated by scientists and engineers because they were the ones that had access to the early internet. The first browser I mentioned, 1991. Before that, there were news groups, bulletin boards, and so on. And because of that, beer brewing has taken on quite a technical tint to it. For example, John Palmer, who arguably did the sort of definitive book on homebrewing, started in the 90s publishing online, and indeed published his first book out of his garage. He published about 15,000 copies, or I can't remember, 5,000 copies, something like that, piled them up in his garage and literally sold them to homebrew shops around the country. John happens to be an engineer as well. I'm a computer engineer. John's a mechanical engineer. But because of that, beer brewing is a lot more technical than many other beverage arts, if you will. So if you sit down and talk to a winemaker, or you sit down and talk to a mead maker or a cider maker, you're going to find that they have a whole different approach to things than we do. So I mean, best way I can illustrate this is if I sit down with somebody like John Palmer, who's a good friend of mine. We do a lot of things together, actually, go fishing and such. But John Palmer and I will often have a discussion about something detailed and technical, like, you know, the details of water and how to adjust your mash pH and how to play with water chemistry to get this effect or that effect. At the opposite end of the spectrum, though, if I sit down with somebody like Randy Mosher, you know, Randy Mosher, of course, is the author of Radical Brewing, Mastering Homebrew, a few other books. The discussion will go more like this. And in fact, I had this discussion with him one day. You know, Randy, how you doing? How are things going? And he'll go, yeah, doing good. I said, what are you working on now? He says, you know, I had some bananas in the kitchen that were going bad. And so I fried them up, and I decided to make a beer, you know, around these bananas, basically. And so, I mean, Randy has a totally different approach to it. And the reason is because Randy is not a scientist or an engineer. Randy is a graphic artist. And so when you sit down and talk to Randy, he doesn't design beer the same way that that I do, for example. So you know, I'm not sure there's a perfect balance here, but I think, you know, understanding the mechanical, technical aspects of beer is important, but really you need to also understand the artistic end of things. And in particular, one of the things I love about Randy Mosher is he has a real focus on flavors. And if you've read some of his books, you know, he likes to put innovative flavors. He'll make beer out of almost anything. And not only that, Randy's gone to great lengths to understand the flavors of, you know, the basic ingredients that we use. So the gist of this presentation for the next 45 minutes or so is I'm going to go through the 4 basic ingredients, and I'm going to talk about not only some of the technical aspects of brewing, but I'm going to talk about some of the flavors you get from the various ingredients, because really understanding those flavors are very important. So there's a whole bunch of different approaches you can take to brewing beer. And here's one from Gordon Strong, who's another good friend of mine. Gordon actually has a different approach than, say, you know, let me go over real quick the tradition, you know, sort of traditional approach is, okay, I'm going to brew a amber bock. And so I'll go up and research the amber bock, you know, style guide or style guidelines, and I'll pull some numbers up, and I'll go find some recipes, and I'll, you know, some sample recipes that are amber bock, and then I'll, you know, work those together into a grain bill and eventually everything else around it. And that's a valid approach. It's not a bad approach, but I like this approach too. Gordon doesn't do that. Yeah, you know, Gordon is a 3-time Nicasia Award winner, 3-time top homebrewer in the United States. He actually likes to work in building blocks. So what he does, rather than start with a blank sheet of paper every time, he will sit down and go, you know, I've got something that works in this porter over here, and I've got something that works, you know, in this, you know, lager over here, and he'll smash them together to create a bock or something like that. So what he's doing is he's not starting from scratch every time. He's using things that he knows already kind of, you know, flavor combinations that kind of work together already, and smash them together. And there's a quote by Steve Jobs down there at the bottom. And, you know, I mean, the cell phone wasn't, you know, the modern cell phone, the iPhone, if you will, wasn't created in a vacuum. It was, you know, somebody took the cell phone, which is an existing device, and took the, you know, PDA, which was a, you know, existing device, and smashed them together to really create this device that's kind of ubiquitous now. And again, just to illustrate a little more, I was making pancakes one morning, and I pulled out a box of Bisquick, and it turns out you can do all kinds of cool things with a box of Bisquick. You can make biscuits, you can make waffles, you can make pancakes, you can make dumplings, you can make strawberry shortcake, etc. What's interesting about this is that all those things are made from a lot of the same basic ingredients, things like, you know, butter and eggs and water, and of course the flour mix, vanilla, you know, those kinds of things. The difference here, though, is that you all have expert knowledge in all those ingredients. You all have at some point stuck your finger in the butter. You've all tasted, raw salt. You've all tasted flour before. You've tasted vanilla before. And you've done that since you were a kid. And so you know exactly what those things taste like. You probably have really good ideas of what happens if I mix two of them together, or even three of them together, or four of them together. And you've been baking or cooking likely your whole life as well. So you have a lot of expert knowledge in that area. The problem is you don't have that same level of expert knowledge when it comes to beer ingredients. And so, as I mentioned in the presentation, I'm going to go through each of the ingredients. We're going to talk about some tips, if you will, working with those ingredients. And then we're going to also talk a little bit about the flavors and groupings, and so how you can understand them a little better. So I'm going to start with grains down here. So here's some grain tips and techniques to start with. The first one is, simplicity. Your beer recipe should not be everything but the kitchen sink. It should be a combination of a base malt, whether that's a pale malt or a Munich malt or whatever, and a small number of selected specialty malts that are there each for a purpose, that have a specific purpose in mind. And I'll give you an extreme example. I had somebody email me a recipe from a couple of weeks ago, and he goes, I don't know what's wrong with this recipe. It came out horrible. The original gravity, or the final gravity, came out really, really high, and it's really too sweet, and it doesn't taste right. And I looked at the recipe, and it was like 40% specialty malts. Now, most specialty malts are not really all that fermentable. So, I mean, that really means that, like 40% of his grain bill was basically non-fermentables. And he was wondering why the final gravity was so high on the beer. But you really should, just start with a base malt. You only need to add a very small number of malts, even to make something as exotic as an Irish stout. You don't need a huge percentage of specialty malts to get the right flavor balance out of it. The next point is avoid the harsh zone malts. I'm going to talk a lot about the harsh zone malts on the next slide. But there's a number of malts between 70 and 200 Lovibond that have very harsh flavoring to them. You want to use those sparingly because they can easily overwhelm your beer. The next concept is flavor and depth first and color last. And what I mean by that is you pick your specialty malts not based on the color or whatever. You really want to base them on the flavor that you're shooting for. Malt flavor is the most important thing. And also I want to talk about depth. I'm a big fan of porters. In fact, I like all the English styles. It just so happens. But one of the things I hate is I go to a brew pub here and I order a porter, and it's like a one-dimensional beer. It's basically like, it's got one layer to it. Maybe it's chocolate malt, or maybe it's, black patent malt, but it has no depth to it. I enjoy beers with a lot of depth. So what I prefer to do is, if you mix malts from different malt groups, I'm going to talk about the malt groups here in a second, you can get layers of depth in the flavor now. And that's exactly how you do it. So rather than picking everything but the kitchen sink or just throwing one malt in there, if you pick malts that are different styles, different groupings, and different flavor profiles, now you can get depth in your beer, and you get depth throughout the beer, if you will. And then the last thing is, you can consider steeping your roast malts. This is a technique that I think Gordon Strong mentioned in his book. Originally, he said, well, take your dark malts and put them in a tea. The concept here is pretty simple. If you consider, making coffee in an old-time percolator and leaving it in there for 60 minutes or something like that, you're going to get a really harsh, overly strong, overly tannic. Tannic, I mean like sucking on a tea bag. You're going to get a lot of harsh flavors in that coffee, if you will. And the same is kind of true for really dark roast malts. So if you're working with really dark roast malts and you're trying to make something like an Irish stout, yeah, you can go ahead and throw it in the mash. It's not going to hurt it because you're looking for that really strong, harsh flavor. If you're trying to make something more subtle, maybe like a sweet stout, now you might want to consider steeping the malts for the really dark malts, steep them for a shorter amount of time. And the technique most of us use to do that now is you add it at the end of the mash. So you wait until the end of the mash, you sprinkle the malts on the top, and then you go ahead with your sparge. They effectively get steeped when you do that. And they don't add a lot of fermentables anyway, so they don't really need to be in the mash. So it's perfectly appropriate to add them at the end. And in fact, I just added a feature for BeerSmith to support this. They're called, I call them sparge malts, but it's malts that are added right before the sparge. They're not included in the main mash. I want to spend a few minutes on this slide because this is actually a very important slide. This is from Randy Mosher's Mastering Homebrew book. As I mentioned, Randy's a graphic artist. He does a great job laying these things out. What I've got here is the 4 basic malt groups, which includes base malts, kiln malts, or I also call them sometimes colored malts, and then roast or black malt on the outside. And then in the middle, of course, you got caramel and crystal malts, which are made in a slightly different way. And I'll walk through real quickly how the malting process works. Most of you know malt starts as barley grain, which is just barley seeds, if you will. And during the malting process, what you do is you take the seeds, you get them very, very wet, usually by sinking them in a bucket or a pile of water, bucket of water or something like that. And of course, if you take the seeds and you get them wet, what happens is they start to germinate and they actually start to grow. And so during the malting process, they allow these seeds to grow, usually for several days, until they have a little rootlet that grows on the inside of the malt. And when the rootlet reaches about the length of the grain, the actual seed itself, they will dry it out. And when it also develops a green shoot on the top, a little tiny shootlet, if you will. And what they do is they dry it out by putting it in a kiln at fairly low temperature, actually, and running a lot of hot air through it. Typically, they tumble it inside of the kiln in order to do that. So that dries it out, and that creates something like a pale malt or a Pilsner malt. Now, if you want to make it darker, when it's partially dried out, you heat it up a little bit. And if you heat it up to, or you can even take the dry malt and heat it. You can do this in your oven if you want. You can make the darker malts. You can make the toasted malts, the Munich malts, the amber malts, the biscuit malts, aromatics, and all the way up to brown malt. If you take that same pale malt and you heat it up to 400, 500, 600 degrees, now you can make, and I'm sorry, I'm working in Fahrenheit here, but high temperature basically, you'll get the roast black malts, anything from light chocolate all the way up to black patent malt. And then finally, in the middle, the caramel malt's actually made a little different. So what they do with caramel malts is they leave it wet, and they actually heat it up to the mashing temperature, which is about 160, 150 something degrees Fahrenheit or 65 degrees Celsius. Same temperatures that you would mash in. And effectively what they do is they mash the grain within the husk. So the center of the grain gets mashed in the husk. That's what develops that sweetness, if you will, that's in caramel and crystal malt. Then they go through the same process to dry it up and then heat it up if necessary to create the darker crystal malts. So that in a nutshell is how the different malts are made. They're all different groups. They all have distinct flavors to them. I do want to mention the harsh zone malts, though. You'll notice there's hardly any malts created between roughly 70 Lovibond and 200 Lovibond. And the reason for that is because the malts in that range take on a lot of very harsh character. Some of the flavors they develop, including, really harsh tannins, as well as burnt marshmallows, burnt toast, almost cindery type flavors that really aren't very good in beer. So they don't really produce a lot of malts in that zone. The only ones that are the crystal malts, and the only reason they're produced is because the sweetness offsets some of the harsh flavors to some degree. However, if you're an extract or an all grain brewer and you want to make a brown ale and you go for that, like Crystal 80 or Crystal 100, you'll pretty quickly find that can overwhelm the beer. So the key to using any of these harsh zone malts is use them very sparingly. For example, if I'm going to make a porter and I want to put some Special B in it, which, Special B, if you use a really small percentage, can give some nice dark fruit flavors, some roasted flavors, coffee-like flavors. I'll probably only put maybe 2% or 3% at tops in there. If you get to even 5% Special B, a lot of times it'll overwhelm the beer pretty quickly. The other consequence of this harsh zone is if you're working with something like brown malt is going to be more harsh than aromatic malt because it's closer to the harsh zone. And the interesting one that a lot of people aren't aware of, but pale chocolate is actually harsher than chocolate malt because it's closer to this harsh zone. So it's just something you need to be aware of when you're working with these malts is the closer you are to the harsh zone, if you're in the harsh zone, you want to be careful how much you put in. You don't need a large percentage to get the effect that you're looking for. This is a malt data sheet. And on the right, they just started producing these spider charts. They've been using spider charts for a long time with hops. Most of the hop producers produce them, and they're great because they provide you some idea of what the flavor profile is for the malt or the hop. But they've just started producing spider charts now for malts. These are from Brees. So Brees has a set of these online. If you go to their website, you can pull them up and look at them. But the malt sheets typically include what's on the left here. On the right, I mentioned the spider charts. That you can see it's got sweet, malty, bready, graham cracker, and you get an idea of what the flavor profile is. It's also got the strength, what the flavor profile is for this particular malt. In this case, it's a pale malt, so it's not that interesting. But this is useful if you're working with a new malt. On the left side, I've got some of the data sheets. The first one is the extract, fine grain, dry basis. That's the percentage by weight that you can extract from the grain if you finally crush it and work it in a laboratory. In the real world, we don't get that number out because we're not working in a laboratory with laboratory equipment. Typically, your brew house has a brew house efficiency number associated with it, and you actually apply both those numbers to get to the amount of gravity points, if you will, that are extracted into the wort that create original gravity. The other one I highlighted there is protein. Protein is important because it adds body to the beer, but protein also reduces the clarity of the beer. So depending on the style of beer you're making, if you're making something super clean and light like a Kolsch, which almost tastes like a lager, you probably want to pick a low protein malt. If you're making an Irish stout, you don't really have to worry about it. And then diastatic power down at the bottom. You'll probably hear me talk later about highly modified malts. A lot of the malts we work with today are highly modified, which means they have a lot of enzymes. The diastatic power number is actually a measure of how much enzymes are in the malt. So just a few tips there. I'm going to walk through the malt groups and talk a little bit about flavoring. The base malts, pale, pilsner, mild, and Vienna, generally have, obviously a malty flavor to them, but they have a white bread, cracker flavors. The mild and Vienna have a little bit of caramel or toast in them. But they don't pick up a lot of the fruity flavors that you'll get from, like a caramel malt, for example. If we move to the second group, which is caramel malts, Cara Pils is very neutral. It's also sold as Cara Foam. It mainly adds body and foam to it, or I should say foam retention to the beer. It doesn't add a lot of flavor. As you get into the light caramel malts, now you get some of the flavors that you probably associate with traditional English beers, the light aroma, the apricots, the raisins, the figs, as well as sweetness that comes through. The caramel sweetness comes through in these caramel malts. As you get to the medium ones, you're already getting some of the burnt. When I talk about medium, I'm talking about maybe 30, 40 Lovabond. You're already getting some of the burnt flavors in there, the intense toast, the burnt sugar, the toasted marshmallow. But as we get into the darker caramel malts, you also get some of the darker fruit flavors in. So that includes things like dried figs, dried raisins, dried prunes, these darker flavors that you might associate, again, with a lot of English beers. And then, of course, when you get to the dark malts, including all the way up to Special B, and this includes like 60, 80, 100. Special B is about 120 Lovabond. Now you're in this harsh zone. You have to worry about the intense burnt sugar flavors, the toasted raisins, the Turkish coffee. You can get, if you use too much, you get burnt marshmallow, burnt toast, other flavors out of it. So you want to use those sparingly. The colored or kiln malts includes Munich, amber, honey, melanoidin, and brown malt. They tend to have a little bit lighter flavors, but they don't pick up a lot of the fruit flavors that you have from something like a caramel malt. So if you want, the toasted cookie without the caramel flavor, you want to use a colored or kiln malt. Munich and honey malts give you a caramel or cookie bite. You can even make cookie recipes. I've had recipes that taste like cookies that use just a huge, large portion of this. Amber and melanoidin, now they take on more of a biscuit, toasty flavors again, but they don't carry the caramel. They don't carry over the fruity or raisin flavors that you get from caramel malts. And then brown, of course, is on the edge of the harsh zone. So you got mocha, chocolate, toasty flavors out of it. If we go into the roasted malts, I mentioned light chocolate. It can actually be quite harsh and quite sharp. So if you're using a light chocolate, you probably want to use it in small quantities. Chocolate malt is a little more sharp and piercing actually than black malt. You would probably think the opposite, but it's not. Carafa is very interesting. Carafa is bittersweet. It's smoother than chocolate. You can also get, if you look around, you can get what's called dehusked Carafa. And that is a great thing to put in something like a sweet stout, because dehusked Carafa means that they took the husk off of the grain first when they either before or after they roasted it. And the husk of the grain contains most of the tannins, which give you a lot of that sharp, piercing bitterness. So if you work with dehusked Carafa, you can get some of the dark roast flavor, but without the piercing, harsh flavors that you might get from some of the other malts. And then, of course, most of you are probably familiar with black patent malt, and roast barley is a little bit interesting in that it's not malted. It's actually raw barley that's burned to a crisp, and that's how you get roast barley, or they also call it stout roast, and that gives you the distinctive flavor of Guinness, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Want to dive into hops techniques and tips. The first one I want to talk about is aroma. I've sat down with a whole bunch of professional brewers at various times, and we'll sit around the table and we'll open like 10 or 12 different hop varieties. And what you do to sample them is you quite literally, crush them with a spoon or something like that if they're pellets. You get them in your hands like this, and then you rub your hands together, and then you get your nose right up in the middle of it. And that is actually how professionals sample their hops and pick hops, which hops they're going to use. You'll find out if you do this with even just a handful of packages that there's a huge variety in the aroma you're getting off the hops. You can also tell which ones are fresh because they'll really pop. The aroma and the flavor will really pop through to your nose. You'll also be able to tell very quickly which ones are bad. And I wanted to make a point of that because there's a whole bunch of people that make beer by brewing up the beer. And then when it's time to put the hops in, they rip the foil packet open and they dump them in the beer. And you may have just taken a really great beer and put bad hops in it if you haven't sampled the hops first. And I can tell you every time we do this with a set of professionals where we open 6 or 8 packages of hops, there's almost always at least one stinker in the pile of hops. And maybe that hops wasn't grown right. Maybe it wasn't harvested at the right time. Maybe it got wet. Maybe it wasn't packaged right, whatever. But the last thing you want to do is dump one of those stinkers into your beer. So before you even start brewing, I really encourage you to open the package of hops, get your nose up inside of it, and make sure it's a good package of hops before you even think about throwing it in your beer. I think most of us have moved to a single boil edition, and I'm going to talk about why that is on the next slide. And also a large portion of us have moved to using, large amounts, particularly the IPA craze here, of Whirlpool and steep and dry hops because they preserve the aroma a lot better. So, I mean, you can do this at home just by adding the hops after flame out. So basically after you finish the boil, let it sit for a few minutes and then add some hops there at that point. You're going to get different effects. Obviously, the boil edition is typically to get you the base bitterness for the beer, whereas the Whirlpool and dry hop editions are mainly to preserve the aroma oils in the hops, to give it that nice finish when you open it up. Because the overall perception of bitterness is a combination of both the actual bitterness, what we call alpha acids that are in the beer from the boil. There's alpha acids in the hops. They get isomerized during the boil, and that creates the bulk of the bitterness, or IBUs, in your beer. But it's a combination of that plus the aroma from the beer, and the aroma comes through from these Whirlpool and dry hop editions. And then, of course, I'll mention aroma oils fade with time. So if you talk to somebody like Vinny from Russian River, Vinny Chalerzio, from Russian River, he produces almost all of his, one of the top IPA producers in the United States, produces almost all his beer out of the tap, sells it out of the tap, because as soon as you put it in a bottle and it sits on the shelf for even 30 days, the aroma starts to fade in something like a big IPA. Here's why most of us have moved away from these so-called, 5-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute so-called flavor and aroma additions. These are the major hop compounds that are aromatic. So these are the aroma oils in the hops, if you will. And these are the ones that you generally want to preserve doing whirlpool or dry hopping. But this is how quickly they boil off in the boil. So if you look at the first one, which is, I'm not sure if you read the small details on the screen, but the first one happens to be myrcene, which is the largest percentage actually on most hops. And myrcene, about 2/3 of it is gone in just over 10 minutes of boiling. So if I do a 5 or 10 minute boil addition, so-called aroma addition, I'm not really getting much aroma out of that. A lot of that oil is just boiling away. And similarly, linalool, geraniol, these are other major hop aroma oils. They boil off quickly. So this is why most of us have moved to doing a single boil addition to get the bitterness, the base bitterness, the isomerized alpha acids, if you will, that we want in the beer, and then doing whirlpool or dry hopping to preserve these delicate hop aromas. Okay, now I'm going to walk through some of the hop groups here. I'm going to start with the noble hop groups. I'll mention the spider charts on the right are also available for hops, so you can get a good idea of what the aroma and flavors you're going to get out of the hops, if you will. And these are the particular ones I pulled up here from Hopsteiner, but a lot of the major hop producers do produce these spider charts now. You can get them on the websites. So the first group I'm going to talk about, of course, is the noble hops group. This is the continental hops from Europe. It includes things like Saaz, Hallertauer, Hersbrucker, Strisselspalt, Spalter, Tettnanger is another big one. So these are the ones used in a lot of German and Belgian beers, as well as Vienna and so on. They tend to be low alpha acid. They tend to have a lot of herbaceous, even flowery aromas to them. Some of them have a little note of spice. For example, like Saaz is known to be a little bit spicy, traditionally used in the original Budvar. So I mean, they're very good hops. They're very clean hops in general. They don't have a lot of off flavors to them, which is why they're called noble hops, and traditionally used in German beers, for example. The Britannic group, which you're probably very familiar with, is almost the opposite of that. The Britannic group has a lot of spicy, earthy, herbal, woody, grassy, green, tangy flavors. East Kent Goldings is perhaps the defining example for the group, but many of you are probably familiar with Fuggles, Willamette, Northdown, Northern Brewer, other traditional English hops. And they aren't particularly clean, but they do add complexity, particularly when you think about something like, an English pub ale. It has a lot of complexity to it. It doesn't have, it's got a combination of flavors that are interesting, if you will, not simple. It's not clean like an IPA or a US IPA, if you will. Next is the Cascade group. This is the sort of the defining group for the American, pale ale and then IPA revolution here in the United States. And this includes things like Cascade, Centennial, Simcoe, Chinook, Tomahawk, CTZ, which is Columbus, Tomahawk, and Zeus, often used interchangeably. Mosaic is another big one, obviously, today. But these are grown primarily now in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, up in Oregon and Washington. And they're very widely used in the craft beer revolution here in the United States. You can almost name the hops and then name the beer. I mean, Cascade was used in the original Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. Centennial's used in Bell's Two Hearted Pale Ale, or IPA, I should say. Simcoe is Russian River. But they're piney, they're citrusy. They have a lot of these aroma oils in them. So they work well for dry hopping and whirlpool hopping. They're pungent. They have some spice to them. A lot of them have piney notes because of they have high percentages of myrcene. They also have thiols, which I'll talk more about thiols in just a minute. But I mean, this is used tremendously here in the United States. Over 50% of the craft beer produced here in the United States are IPAs now. And really almost all of them are made with either these hops or the one I'm going to show you on the next slide, which is the Pacific Group. These are hops that actually have American heritage. So back to mainly hops from the Pacific Northwest. But these hops are grown in Australia and New Zealand. And when you take the hops and grow them in Australia and New Zealand, they do take on a distinct personality from the terroir there, I guess. They're fruity, particularly they take on a lot of fruity characters. So you get apricots, passion fruits, grapes, gooseberry. A lot of them have wine flavors, which is why some of them are named after wine, like Nelson Sauvin. But these are very desirable hops today because the IPAs with a little bit of fruity hint in them have become very, very popular here in the United States. So this includes things like Citra, Moteca, Nelson Sauvin. Some of these are hard to get. A lot of times you pay a premium in order to purchase these hops because they are desirable. The next group is the bittering only hops. A lot of these came out of hop breeding programs in the United States that were done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And at that time, there was only a couple of beers brewed in the United States here. And so the goal of the big brewers was to see how much alpha acid they could put into an acre of hops. Because what they would do is they would take these hops and then they would turn them into hop extract. And then they'd store them perhaps for years until they actually needed to use them in the beer. So this is how a lot of the large brewers were operated. So they drove the hop research programs, funded them. And it created a whole bunch of hops that are primarily bittering hops. They don't have a lot of high percentage of aroma oils in them, but they are very cheap generally, and they're also great for bittering. So, this includes things like Magnum, Hercules, Millennium, Southern Cross, Eldorado. Great for boiling, not always great for aroma, although some people have been experimenting with aroma use. And I mean, depending on, you can actually look up the aroma oil contents depending on what you're trying to target. You can use them in some cases for aroma. And I wanted to spend a minute on new trends in hop techniques. I got this research from my good friend Stan Hieronymus, and Stan pulls together hop research. He wrote the hop book, I think from all over the world now. But recent research indicates that geraniol and linalool, which are two of the larger aroma oils that are in hops, play a major role in delivering these fruit flavors. And I mentioned these fruit flavors have become very desirable. Things like the New England IPA, has a lot of this fruity IPA flavor to it. So anyways, hops that are high in geraniol and linalool are very good for using in this technique that I'm going to mention. And that includes things like Citra, Mosaic, Moteca, Sriracha Ace, Nelson Sauvin. They have high levels of geraniol and linalool. They also have thiols in them, which thiols are actually really important too. The thiols actually play a critical role in getting the fruit flavor in the finished beer. And what happens if you take some of these hops that are high in these thiols, geraniol and linalool, and you dry hop during active fermentation, typically it's done near the end of fermentation, because if you do it too early, the CO2 bubbling up through the beer will actually push all the aroma oils out. So typically you add it at the end of fermentation, but there's actually a biotransformation that takes place, which creates these cool tropical fruity flavors that everybody's trying to get nowadays. What's interesting about thiols, I wanted to mention, thiols are critical for this. They've known this for a long time in winemaking. Thiols are really big in winemaking. They're really a tiny, tiny percentage of the hop, but thiols primarily exist in US hops. And so you really need to pick varieties that are either US hop varieties or, as I mentioned, the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand hop varieties, which are derived from the US hops, have these high level of thiols that you need to get these fruity flavors into your IPA. So that's just some of the latest research. I'm going to talk about yeast and tips and techniques for just a few minutes. Yeast flavors, first of all, are usually manifest themselves as off flavors, and it just becomes a matter of what percentage you get to reach some flavor threshold for the beer that you're doing. So I mean, every single yeast is going to produce things like esters, acetaldehyde, diacetyl, phenolics and some of these other flavors we'll talk about. But it's a matter of how much, in what quantity they produce them. And it's also a matter of what flavor, what beer you're brewing. For example, if I'm brewing a traditional English ale, which is high in these fruity ester flavors, esters are fruity, the sort of the fruity flavors. It starts with sort of a pear flavor, but you need a variety of other fruits out of it as well. Then it's perfectly appropriate to have a high level of esters in an English ale. It would be totally inappropriate to have that same high level of esters in a continental lager, for example. And so, the yeast flavors are usually manifest themselves as off flavors. And again, it's a matter of perspective. The other thing I want to mention is yeast health is essential. I'm going to show you a slide next that lists all the off flavors and how many of them are yeast related. But, if you don't pitch enough yeast, if you don't hydrate or perhaps use a starter, if you're working with liquid yeast, if you don't aerate with oxygen, or at least aerate your work with air of some kind, and control your temperatures and good sanitation, a lot of times you're going to accentuate or create more of these off flavors. And this is an interesting slide. So what I did is I took the BJCP score sheet, which is the Beer Judge Certification Program. It's the program that we use here in the United States, and I think a large portion of the world, to judge beer. And what I did is I took the left half of the sheet and put it on the right side here. Those are the BJCP scoring off flavors. And I've listed them all here. And you can see that about, I don't know, roughly just under a dozen of them are yeast related. So things like acetaldehyde, which is like a green apple flavor, is yeast related. It's an incomplete fermentation. Alcoholic comes from usually fermenting too hot. You'll get secondary fusel alcohols created. Diacetyl is like a buttery flavor that you get from yeast. Esters, I mentioned, are fruity flavors that you get from yeast. Usually when yeast gets warmer, it produces more esters. Phenolic, we'll talk about in a minute, solvent flavors, sour, et cetera. So a lot of these things are yeast related. So it is important that you take good care of your yeast. Excuse me. Okay, so here's the popular yeast groups, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them and maybe show some examples here. But English ale yeast, I already mentioned, are higher in esters and lower in attenuation. So you tend to get more complexity in the beer. You get these fruity flavors in the beer. The lower attenuation leaves some malty flavors in the beer. A lot of times these are fermented at higher temperatures, which gives you secondary fusel alcohols. So I mean, you get more complexity from an English ale yeast than something else, if you will, like a California ale yeast, which we'll talk about. If we look at the opposite of an English ale yeast, it's probably the California ale yeast, which is high attenuation. So it ends up with a really low finishing gravity. They're fast fermenting. They have a clean finish. They're used to highlight the hops in the beer, which is why they're, most of the hops, most of the IPAs here are made with something like a California ale yeast. They give a good clean finish to the beer, so you can really sort of highlight the hops, which is really what everybody's trying to do here in the United States now. German ale yeast, there's a wide variety. Kolsch is a style that's almost like a lager, super clean. To alt, which so is more accentuated towards the malty finish. German wheat yeast is a good example of a yeast that has produces a lot of off flavors. Actually, what it does is it produces a huge amount of phenolics. And if you've ever had a Bavarian wit or a Weizen, they have that really strong banana clove flavor. The clove actually comes from the phenolics, and so it's really hard to make a Hefeweizen without the proper German wheat yeast, because a large component of the flavor of that beer comes from the phenolics that are produced by that particular yeast strain. So, I mean, that's just a good example. Belgian wit yeast also has a high phenolics, but through a combination of spices and sweetness, they're able to balance that out and produce an entirely different style of beer. Belgian ale yeast, Belgium's kind of like Disneyland of beer. There's like 100 different yeast strains within a few square miles. So that's just a huge variation in Belgian strains and also what they produce. And I went backwards there. Okay, I'm not going to dive into the rest of the yeast strains, but I will go into just a few minutes on water. The first thing I want to say about water is if you're an extract brewer, so if you're a fairly new brewer and you're still brewing with extract, A lot of times you don't need to worry much about your water chemistry. And the reason is because the extracts you're brewing with are created by somebody who's already gone through taken some grain, they've already mashed it, and they've already concentrated that down, usually by either boiling it or a lot of times they boil it under a vacuum to keep the temperature down, but concentrated it down to a syrup or dry malt extract that you're working with. And because of that, they've already done the water chemistry. And the primary point where you're worried about water chemistry is actually during the mash. So if you're an extract brewer, it's perfectly appropriate to use something like RO water or distilled water that really doesn't have anything in it, because somebody's already done the chemistry for you, and those ions are still in the concentrated malt that you bought. Now, if you're an all grain brewer, you might want to consider learning a little bit more about the three things I'm going to talk about here. So the first one is you do want to understand your water source, and you can do that a variety of different ways. You can get a test kit and do it at home. A lot of times a club will go out and buy a test kit and they'll share it. You can send your water into a lab. There's a number of labs. Ward Labs, for example, here does a very simple at-home thing where you send them a sample and they'll do a brewing water test on it. It is important when you do a test, you want to do a brewing water test to get the right things back. And I'll talk about the 6 ions that you're concerned about in the next slide. But you want to know that your water is in the good range or safe range to brew. The second topic I want to talk about is mash pH. If you're an all grain brewer and you're working with a mash, it's actually important to get your pH right. There's a bunch of benefits that come from having the pH in the right range during the mash phase. And when I say during a mash, I mean during that conversion step is really where you want to make sure the mash pH is correct. Basically what happens here is, if you remember your high school chemistry, water has a pH of about 7. Generally, the water coming out of your tap maybe just a little bit higher than that. It's slightly alkaline, if you will. Then as you go up, the number becomes alkaline. As you go down, it becomes acidic. Usually it's a little bit over 7 because it's picking up some stuff from the ground. And what happens is you're going to mix that water with a bunch of crushed malt, and the crushed malts are acidic. So light malt is slightly acidic. Dark malt is highly acidic. So what that means for you is, if you're making a dark beer like a stout or a porter, a lot of times you don't need to worry about your mash pH at all, because a lot of times there's enough acid in the malt itself to get you down into the good pH range. However, if you're making a light beer, like an ale or a lager, light colored lager, light colored ale, you do have to quite often worry about the mash pH. And the best way to do that is to either estimate your mash pH using software, or you can measure mash pH with a pH meter and then adjust it with something, some kind of acid. Most of us work with lactic acid. So I actually do a hybrid of these two techniques. What I typically will do is I'll estimate the software, and let's say, for sake of argument, the software says I need 7.5 milliliters of acid or something like that, lactic acid. I'll add some of that up front. So maybe I'll add 5 of that up front, and I'll save the rest till the end when I have time to actually take a measurement with my pH meter after I've mashed in. The reason I do that is because the modern malts are so highly modified, which means they have a huge amount of enzymes in them, that the conversion starts almost as soon as you mash in. And because of that, you want to be in this good range as early as possible. So most of us add the acid up front before we mash in, or at least a portion of the acid up front before we mash in. So we get down to this good range, and then we'll make a final adjustment after we've had time to mash in. Because in many cases, by the time I mash all the grains in, get all the dough balls out, get the temperature stabilized, and then actually pull out the pH meter, take a measurement, it might be 20 or even more minutes into the mash. And in many cases, a lot of that conversion's already done at that point. So, so that's what I have to say about mash pH. And then the last point I want to talk about is the sulfate to chloride ratio. On the next slide, I've got, these are the big 6 water ions. 2 of those are sulfate and chloride. You'll get those from your water report. And basically you take those 2 and you divide them. Typically in parts per million, you just divide them and you get a ratio. And if it's 1, it's balanced, which means you have roughly the same amount of sulfate and chloride, it's balanced. If it's over 1, you're actually going to enhance the bitterness of the beer. So if I have more sulfate, I'm going to create more bitterness enhancement to the beer. And again, this is just your perception of the beer. It doesn't actually change the bitterness level, but it changes the perception of your beer. And the other one is if I add more chloride, of course, I'm going to enhance the malt character of the beer. So depending on the style I'm brewing, I can add a little bit more sulfate, or I can add a little bit more chloride, and I can change the balance perception of my beer. So it's just another thing you can tweak with or play with when you're working with your water. These are the big 6 water ions: calcium, magnesium, sodium, sulfate, chloride, bicarbonate. I'll do them in pairs real quick. So let's take sulfate and chloride, we just mentioned on the last slide, of course, affect the bitterness or malt perception of the beer. So those are 2 of the variables you can play with. I've also got the ranges listed here. The ranges are what you would consider good brewing water. So if your water is outside of these ranges, you probably need to add some water salts, or you need to consider diluting your water with something like distilled water, so you can get it down to the good range. 2 more I want to work with are bicarbonate and calcium, the top and the bottom one. Calcium generally acidifies the mash, so calcium in a lot of ways is good because it lowers your mash pH. Usually your mash pH is too high. Usually you're trying to lower it. So calcium usually is positive. Bicarbonate is usually negative because it's trying to raise, it's alkaline, it's trying to raise that mash pH, so it's working against you a lot of times when you're trying to get down to the good range. And then the last 2 are magnesium and sodium. Magnesium is just needed in small amounts for fermentation. It's a trace element. And sodium plays a small role in enhancing the sweetness or body of the dark beers, but it doesn't play a major role in the overall flavor. So that's, those are the 3 main points I have on water. I know I crushed a lot in there. You could probably talk for several hours on water. I know John Palmer can. But I wanted to just give you 3 tips to 3 things to look into or research and consider as you're working with water. I will mention one more thing about water. I think most of you are probably familiar with Brewlosophy, and Brewlosophy is an interesting website. What they do is they publish experiments. So they do experiments where they create 2 beers that are exactly the same except for one thing, and then they do a triangle test with blind taste testing to see who can actually pick out, what percentage of the people can actually pick out the beer that's different. And one of the interesting things about Brewlosophy, they've done all kinds of tests on things that you think are really, really important to your beer. And turns out when they go to the blind taste test, nobody can tell them apart. But one of the interesting things is almost all of their water experiments have come out positive, i.e., if you make even small changes to the water in the beer, it actually has a big effect on the flavor of the beer. So I just wanted to make that point as we go on. So anyways, that's a summary. I know I put a lot of information into it fairly quick. I hope I didn't go too far over here. I actually did pretty well. But you need to understand the flavors of your ingredients you're working with. Another interesting experiment you can try as a group, if you ever get back together, hopefully, is they have this thing called the ASBC method for sampling malts. And you can look up ASBC malt, sensory malt, I think they call it, profile. And it basically involves taking a measured amount of malt, like 100 grams of malt, and putting it in a measured amount of water, and then creating a hot tea with it. And then you run it through something like a coffee filter to filter out the malt. And you end up with this nice tea. And it's a great thing to do as a club. You sit down and you make teas of these different malt samples and then taste them. And you'll get it's a very effective method for determining the flavor profile of that malt. So it gives you a point of reference, if you will, to tell how those malts might taste in a finished beer. With that, I'm going to go ahead and take some questions. So thank you. I lost you on the screen, but
yeah, no, I was thought that was a bad time. It was
there's too many people on the screen now.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Yeah, it seemed to freeze up there. That's fine. Okay. So bring this back up. So, I mean, if we start with Alan, your questions, I'll unmute or ask you to unmute. Alan, you there?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Right.
Well, I sent my questions to you before today, and I don't actually have them in front of me.
Oh, okay, no, that's fine. Okay, fine. So
you can read it to me.
Yeah. So I guess the first question you had was, what's the one thing in your experience that can make or break a recipe?
Oh boy. Well, technique is important, but I mean, if you got that basic thing down, then I think probably the next important thing is just flavor balance, getting the right balance of hops, malt, and everything else in the beer is absolutely critical. So, I mean, I try really hard when I'm sitting down with a new recipe to think about, what I'll do, for example, is a lot of times I'll sit down and make a list of, here's all the grains I could include in the beer, or here's all the, some of the hops I might use as a candidate for the beer. And then I start throwing things away because, the simplicity rules apply. So I want to get rid of as many things as I can and have, sort of the finished beer be as simple as possible, the beer recipe as possible. So, I mean, I think that's absolutely critical, is simplicity in the beer and having the right balance of hops and malt in the beer when you're finished. I didn't mention it, but you can look at things like the bitterness ratio is very useful. The bitterness ratio is just the ratio. It's the bitterness divided by the gravity points basically in the beer. And it's very easy to calculate. You can look it up online. But it gives you an idea of the hop balance of the beer and whether you got, like if I'm making something like an English ale, they're moderately hoppy, but they're not overly hoppy. So the bitterness ratio is only going to be, maybe a little over 1. If I'm making a super IPA, it's going to be much, much higher than that, and if I'm making a continental ale, it's going to be quite lower than that. So those are the kinds of tools that I use to help me anyways. Other questions?
All right, yeah, maybe it's simpler for me to do that then. So from Darren, it was what book or reference did you really rely on when starting out brewing?
I think I mentioned I started in 1987, and at that time there was only a handful of books out. The one I had was Charlie Papazian's, what was it? The Joy of Homebrewing, it was called, and I still have it. I have the first edition, which is very interesting to open up these days. I actually pulled it out a couple months ago, and the book had all the recipes are listed in. Typically, it has, for a recipe, it'll have like the quantity of malt or malt extract, and it'll have the quantity of hops. But the hops will just say boil or dry hop, and that's it. It doesn't say how long. It doesn't say when. It doesn't say how. And there's no bitterness units. There's nothing in them. And then a lot of the gravities are estimated or even unknown in some of the recipes. So that was interesting. And then interestingly, the only other books available were a couple books out of the UK, because I guess, we didn't legalize homebrewing until I think it was 1978, something like that. And I believe people in the UK were brewing well before that, homebrewing well before that. So
it wasn't
a couple books out of the UK.
Wasn't C.J.J. Berry, was it? He's kind of one of the famous sort of.
No, I remember Noonan maybe.
Okay.
And I had a recipe one, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name off the top of my head. Line, that's exactly right. Dave Line. I had a recipe book from Dave Line. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Next question was, have you got experience of using midnight wheat in place of dehusked carafa, etc.? And where does that fall in terms of harsh zone?
Unfortunately, I have not played with midnight wheat. But midnight wheat, typically wheat is going to be less harsh because it does not have the high tannic content that barley does in the husk.
Yeah.
So I would expect, just guessing here, but I would expect it to be quite a bit less harsh than a comparable barley.
Yeah. Wheat's evil. Nobody should ever use it in a beer. That's all I can say. Sorry. Sorry. Are you a Reinheitsgebot guy? No, I'm allergic to wheat. So it kind of, yeah.
Your lagers as well, Jerry, let's be honest.
Yeah. Okay. So what's, in your opinion, what's the difference between whirlpool and dry hop editions? Have you ever sort of compared throwing everything into a dry hop, throwing the whole dry hop into 70C, 158F whirlpool versus splitting between the two?
So the difference between whirlpool and dry hop. So what you're trying to do here, let's just explain what you're trying to do. So you're trying to get aroma oils from the hops into the beer, right? You're trying to get them to go into solution. And aromatic oils, by their very nature, do not like to go into solution, because if they like to go into solution, they wouldn't be aromatic. You wouldn't be able to smell them, right? They would just stay in solution. Does that make sense? So you're trying to force these substances that really don't like to go in solution into solution. And there's two primary ways we do that. One of them is with heat, and then the other one is, of course, with time. So heat or contact time is about the only way to get it in. I like to think of the two approaches as two different, those two different things, if you will. In the whirlpool, what you're doing is you're using the temperature to try and force it into solution. In the dry hop, you're really using contact time to try and force it into solution. So that's how I like to sort of think of those two. Now, if you actually go substance by substance, you can look up the vapor point, for example, for the major hop oils, and you'll find out that there are certain hop oils that are more susceptible, more practical for dry hopping than for whirlpool hopping. So, for example, a lot of the hops here in the U.S. have very high myrcene content. And myrcene is one of the major hop oils. It's that piney finish that you get from a lot of the Pacific Northwest hops here in the U.S. And it's a major component of a lot of the IPAs. But myrcene is interesting because it has a fairly low vapor point, or boiling point. So if I want to preserve a lot of myrcene in the hops, if I'm using some of these hops most of the U.S. hops that are high in myrcene, I'm actually better off either dry hopping it or whirlpooling at a lower temperature. Now there's other ones like geraniol and linalool that have a slightly higher point, so I can get away with using some of those in the whirlpool, if you will. But you're definitely gonna. I mean, you can try the experiment. I've done it before, but you get a much different effect if you use the hop in the whirlpool versus in the dry hop. And a lot of that has to do with this, how susceptible the different oils are to each of those techniques.
All right, thank you very much. James asks, how was Randy's banana beer? I don't know if you
I had Randy's banana beer. He actually made, so after he did this at home, he actually made a commercial batch of it, and he saved a bottle for me, and I had it at one of the events we were at. It was not bad. It was not great either. Randy has some amazing ideas, and not every one of them is going to turn out fantastic. It was, you could taste the banana, and it was kind of subtle though. And, overall, it wasn't a beer that I would want to dive into, over and over and over again, but it was interesting. And he had some interesting stories to tell about doing it on a commercial scale, because I can't remember, I think he was trying to heat up, and I believe he heated it before or fried it or something before he did it. But you can imagine trying to do that with several 100 pounds of bananas, which is effectively what he did to create the commercial batch. But I love talking to him because he's just full of great ideas and always finding these interesting ingredients, spices, and he travels a lot to South America and finds these interesting fruits and then brings those back and makes beer with them. A lot of fun.
I was going to say, there is actually an English brewery, I think it's Wells, that does a banana bread beer. So that's maybe a bit similar. So yeah, okay.
Probably a little different, actually. I mean, imagine banana bread's a little different, but.
Yeah. Cool. Next question. What are your top 3 books, if you had to choose just 3, about homebrewing?
Well, I like, John Palmer's new edition is really, really nice. It's got a lot of information packed in there. I'd probably pick that as one of them. I actually am a big fan of Mastering Homebrew as well. If it's not necessarily an advanced brewing book, but I think Randy did a great job, particularly discussing flavors and some of the concepts that I've got in this presentation in the Mastering Homebrew book. And he also did a great job of covering a lot of techniques and things in it. The other thing I like about Mastering Homebrew is it's very approachable. So, I mean, even if you're not if you're a fairly new brewer, you can pick up Mastering Homebrew and learn quite a bit about homebrewing, fairly quickly. And also I mentioned, Randy's a graphic artist, so his stuff's always, just beautifully illustrated. Another one I really like, and it's an older one, Ray Daniels' book, and now I'm trying to remember what's Ray Daniels' classic book? Help me out, guys.
Designing recipes or something?
Designing
Designing
beer?
great
No,
beers.
designing great beers, yeah. What I found, what I like about, and it's quite dated now, so I'm not saying it's the top book in the world, but what I like about the approach is what he did in that book. The basic approach to the book was interesting. What he did was he took top rated beers from beer competitions, basically, and then he laid them out by style. And then he did an analysis of it, contained, this much of this ingredient, this much of that ingredient. And I just found that whole approach to be fascinating. Of course, I'm an engineer, so that's sort of my approach to beer brewing, I guess, is, I'm kind of analytical. But I found that approach to be fascinating and one of my favorites. But another one I'd probably want to mention is just Randy Mosher's Radical Brewing, just because, again, it's packed with great ideas. So those are some of my favorites.
Yeah, good. Yeah, how much time have you got? Because I don't want to.
Well, like I said, I've got time. I got a few more minutes.
Fine. Okay,
yeah, be happy.
All right, because we've got quite a few coming in.
Well, I don't want to tie up your time either. I've
No.
gone on for an
I think
hour,
everyone
over an
here
hour
is,
already, but
I think everyone here is kind of here for the evening now. So yeah, that's fine. So in your opinion, what's the most fun or forgiving style to brew, and also maybe the hardest to nail and get right?
well, I mean, it's hard to go wrong with an English pale ale to some degree. Yeah, I mean, just a simple, English pub ale. And the only reason I say that is because it is more forgiving in terms of, if you get some off flavors into it, it's not necessarily going to ruin the beer. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So it's I think that's one of the easier brews certainly to start with. If you want to work with harder beers, arguably, almost any lager is difficult to do, especially in a homebrew setting. First of all, to do it properly, you usually have to have a fair amount of equipment, refrigeration and such. And the other problem is most of the, particularly any light lager is it shows the flaws. So if you make a very light lager and you got even a little bit of, DMS in it or something like that, which is sort of the cooked corn finish flavor, that flaw will be very apparent in the lager. So I would argue those are some of the hardest ones to brew. Actually, even beyond an English ale, a lot of the dark beers are also very easy to brew because, again, if I make an Irish stout, I can get a whole bunch of things wrong and it'll still taste like an Irish stout because it'll be completely overwhelmed by the the roast barley flavor.
No, that's
Other
fair enough.
questions?
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's actually lager's my favorite to brew. So yeah, that's I enjoy
They're
that.
challenging though, aren't they?
Yeah, it's good fun though. So do you acidify or do you not acidify your sparge water? Or is there times where you would or you wouldn't, depending on the type of recipe?
So you don't need as much acid in the sparge water because it's at the end of the thing. It does help though. There's one reason to do it, and that is, and it's really more of a problem I should mention for commercial brewers and home brewers. A lot of us don't sparge to the point where we have this problem kick in. But what happens is, if the pH of the runnings coming out of the mash tun get much above 6, it's called oversparging, if you will. And when it gives above, if the pH of the runnings get above 6, effectively what happens is you start to extract a lot of tannins out of the mash itself. So these are a lot of the sucking on a tea bag flavors. It's not as big of a problem for most home brewers because we're brewing on such a small scale, and we use proportionally usually more grain, and we got much smaller systems that we're working with. And usually a little bit less efficient system. So it's fairly rare at the homebrew level that you're actually going to push it up above that 6. But at a commercial level, it can happen. And the main reason you'd want to acidify your sparge water is to prevent that from happening. What you're doing is, the pH of the mash itself is going to go up as you run more and more water through it, which makes sense, right? You've got these acidic grains, and I'm slowly pulling, part of the grain away, if you will, into the wort by running alkaline water through it, right? So what happens is, as you're sparging, the pH is always rising. And you just want to keep it below 6. And one of the tricks to keep it below 6, of course, is to just acidify your sparge water a little bit. And again, it doesn't require as much as the main mash. but a little bit, so it keeps it delays that point where you cross that 6 range a little bit. Okay.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Have you got any thoughts on the continuously hopped beers like Dogfish Head, 120-minute IPA, and how would you enter that sort of recipe into BeerSmith? And is it worth it, given the hop oil boil off you mentioned? That's kind of a three-parter.
You're probably gonna hear from me very quickly that I'm not a big fan of it because of the reason I just mentioned. The reason I mentioned earlier is, when you get down to 15, 20 minutes, you're not really doing anything except adding more. First of all, you're adding more vegetal material. And second of all, you're adding some bitterness to the hops, but you're not getting that much aromatics out of it. And the problem is, if I add enough vegetal material, and you'll see this in a lot, I don't know if you have the same IPA craze going on there, but I sample a lot of commercial IPAs that have almost lawnmower flavors to them. And a lot of it's this crazy, over hopping where, hops is good, so more hops is more good, And in fact, it's not the case. Most of us can only perceive hops to like roughly a 60 IBU, 70 IBU threshold. And then anything over that is just really bitter. And the problem is, as you start driving it up more and more and more, you're just adding vegetal material. So again, I could probably achieve the same IBU level with a single hop addition with a lot less hops earlier in the boil. So let's say even a 60-minute hop addition, right? And I'm going to get the same IBUs in there, right? And instead, I'll take some of those hops that I was going to use for this continuous hopping, push those into the whirlpool or the dry hop where they'll be used to much more effect, and it'll add some aroma to it. And the combination of those two will be more powerful, I would argue, than continuous hopping. As far as how to do continuous hopping at BeerSmith, I can't think of an easy way to do it other than just a bunch of really small additions or something like that. But it's not really a technique I recommend. Okay.
Fair enough. Yeah. What's your view on the short mashes and short boils? I guess it's similar to like what you've mentioned with Brewlosophy, and they have their short and shoddy series. And
yep, I did an interview with Marshall. I can't remember, a couple episodes back on the BeerSmith podcast. We had him on doing short and shoddy. First of all, short mashes are very supportable, and the science supports it too. And the reason is because I mentioned that most of the malts we're working with today are what's called highly modified, which means they have a massive amount of enzymes in them. And as a result, as soon as you start to mash in that thing, at the right temperature, that thing will start to convert. And you can do a simple way to do this is an iodine test. You can get a little iodine from the pharmacy and put a couple drops in you take a little sample of the mash, put it on like a white plate, for example, put a couple drops of iodine in it. And if it runs, I got it this right. I think if it runs clear, if it doesn't turn color, then the sugars have already been converted. So there's a really simple test you can do. And I've done this a number of times at home. And I see sometimes in as little as, 30 minutes, the mash is literally done. Because I'm working with, a large percentage of pale malt, usually a small percentage of specialty malt, and it converts very, very quickly. As far as a short boil, the only real concern I'd have with a short boil, and a short boil, I'm assuming you're still doing at least, like 15 minutes or 20 minutes to get the thing sterilized, if you will. The big concern with that is primarily something called DMS, and DMS is sort of a cooked corn flavor, off flavor that can show up in the finished beer. If you don't boil it long enough, they usually recommend I believe a 90-minute boil gets rid of 70 or 80% of the DMS. But again, it depends on what style you're brewing. If I'm brewing an Irish stout, do I really worry about DMS? Probably not. It's a little bit of cooked corn flavor in the middle of this giant, really dark beer, right? So I probably could get away with a 15-minute boil and it would probably be just fine, right? Now, if I'm making something really subtle, like a Kolsch or a lager, am I going to do the longer boil? Probably I am, because I am, concerned. And it's not that you're going to have a massive amount of DMS in your beer, but the beer is subtle enough that it might make a difference. Does that make sense? So, yeah, it's all a matter of, you know, what you're brewing and how much would it matter. But I have, you know, I've had beers with DMS in them and, you know, you can taste it. It's subtle, but you can taste it. It just depends on what you're brewing.
Okay, no, good. I actually had a few different people ask similar questions along the same line. So you mentioned you use lactic acid. Seems that Japanese brewers have a preference for phosphoric. I mean, have you experimented between the two? Have you tried?
I
What the
personally
difference
haven't,
are?
just because lactic acid is really widely available here in the brew stores. So you can, I mean, you walk in any brew store and get lactic acid. Phosphoric acid works too, though. You can even use acetic acid and citric acid, and there's a whole there's a whole bunch of acids you can use. I know citric acid is used by some commercial brewers. So I mean, almost anything that's going to drive the pH down is probably acceptable. But I just know lactic acid is very, very easy to work with because it's not, and you don't put, I mean, you're talking about, 10, 20 mils in a maybe a 10 gallon, 38 liter batch. It's not a lot, and it's not enough to affect the flavor of the beer. So, so that's what I use. But I think BeerSmith calculates, it can do phosphoric. Of course, you can also use acid malt if you're a purist, but acid malt is effectively the same thing as lactic acid, because all they do is they take the malt and they sour it. And when they sour it, it creates lactic acid. Bacteria creates lactic acid, which if you add lactobacillus to your beer, it creates lactic acid. So, so that's all you're really doing is adding some lactic acid anyways.
Okay.
Other questions?
Yeah, no, this one might be slightly leading, but it says, does Brad despair at the current fad, emphasized, for extreme hoppy IPA style beers when there are so many more styles that can be brewed?
Well, I've talked about this more than once on the podcast. I'm not a huge IPA fan. And one of the frustrations I have is I'll go to a brew pub now and I'll order, I think I enjoy a lot of the English styles, and particularly I enjoy a lot of the dark beers. So I'll order something like a porter, and instead of a porter, I will get a dark IPA. And it's frustrating to me when I get that. It's not really what I wanted. I'm not saying I don't appreciate an IPA, but yeah, I don't really fully understand the fad when there are so many great beers out there. But I can tell you for a fact that over half the craft beer produced here in the United States are IPAs, and that is the bulk of the business right now. So
it sells. So yeah.
Yeah, is it the same in the UK? I really don't know.
To a certain degree, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's still a fair number of the traditional styles being made, but yeah, it's IPA, American style IPA, is pretty big, especially this east, the East Coast stuff, Northeast IPA, New England. So,
yeah, I mean those are nice to have. They are enjoyable, but it's not, for me, it's not the end all be all. I know a lot of people enjoy them though.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. So the next one came up, Ines asking, when it comes to bittering hops, does it matter much what you use? Do you get much flavor coming through?
Yeah, it does matter what you use. You're going to get a different flavor characteristic out of each of the bittering hops. Interestingly, doing that, I mentioned the aroma rub, where you take the thing and you put your nose up into it, does actually give you a pretty good idea of some of the, a hint of at least what the bittering flavor of the beer of it is. And each hops is very distinctive. And I'm sure if you've made a number of beers, you probably already know that. For example, something like Northern Brewer, which is used in Anchor Steam beer, it's a traditional English hops. It is, for me, very distinctive. I can taste a beer automatically. Literally, if I taste a beer with that hop in it, I can go, bang, that's that. And some hops are very distinctive like that for me. But yeah, I mean, the hops you choose for bittering is very important, and it does, your beer is going to reflect the character of that hop.
Sorry. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Mac asks, have you ever tried to grow your own hops or to harvest wild yeast?
I have not. So I've had a number of wild yeast beers. I haven't actually made wild yeast beers myself, just because I'm not a huge fan of them. I've sampled a bunch of them. They're interesting, but just doesn't really float my boat, I guess. As far as what was the other half of that? It was growing hops. I have not grown hops myself, but I do have a lot of friends that grow hops, and I've gone over and seen them and tasted them and everything. They're very interesting. One of the challenges though is it's hard to dry out hops properly and store them for very long. So a lot of times if you're working with fresh hops, you almost have to go with a sort of a wet hop approach to it. But it is fun to do. In fact, we have a whole bunch of I don't know what the rules are, but I guess the laws here. I live in Virginia, and they have these things called farmhouse brew houses, and I forget what it is, but they get some kind of special license from the state because they're so-called farmhouses. So you see these fairly large craft beer complexes that have like, half an acre of hops attached to them because of this tax law that they have or whatever. It's kind of interesting. So anyways.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, and again, we seem to still have quite a number of questions coming in, so you let me know if you need to drop for anything. So otherwise, I'll keep going. So Ines asks, do you always mash out, and does it make much of a difference if so?
Sure. The mash out, if you go open some of the really old books that I've got in my library, the mash out at one time was done to so-called stop the mash or whatever and stop the enzymes, but really it doesn't really do that. I mean, it just slows them down. The enzymes have a temperature range at which they act. The reason you would do a mash out today is primarily for viscosity. Actually, what you're doing is as you heat the mash water up, or as you if you heat the sparge water up enough, you'll get a better flow through the mash tun itself. So the time I would do a mash out is usually when I'm working with an adjunct like wheat or something that's non-barley, oats, something like that are fairly thick. The oats and wheat have a high protein content, so they tend to thicken your mash and you can end up with a stuck sparge. So what you do instead is you do a mash out, which raises the temperature of the whole mash bin before you start your sparge. And effectively what it does is it creates more viscosity so that the wort will flow better through the mash tun. So that's really a primary reason for doing it. If I'm using an all barley beer and you got your system tuned correctly for barley, there's really no reason to do a mash out, honestly. So I would say the vast majority of beers that I do, which are mostly all barley, I don't do a mash out. But if I'm working with something like a wheat, like I'm making a wit that's 40% unmalted wheat, which is very thick and syrupy, then yeah, I'll go ahead and do a mash out. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. And then Sarah asks, some brewers are more worried about water treatment than the recipe. Would you suggest newer brewers worry more about water or recipe to begin with?
Well, definitely the recipe. I think I mentioned that point one was just kind of make sure your water's in the good range. You don't want to make water. A good example is one time I lived in the mountains in New Mexico, and we had a well, and the water was absolutely horrible. You couldn't even make orange juice or coffee out of it that tasted, even remotely reasonable. So that is not water that I would use for brewing. In fact, I'd either get distilled or bottled water usually when I had to brew out there. So that, you want to make sure your water is good enough. But if it's good enough, no, that's not the first thing I would worry about at all. In fact, I would worry about, probably as a beginning brewer, I'd worry about, the first thing I'd probably worry about is just sanitation, making sure you keep everything as clean as possible up front. And then I'd probably worry about, start working on process issues like, making sure you're consistently, creating the beer in a consistent way, using the system that you have, keeping it clean, keeping it fresh. Things like pitching enough yeast, those kinds of things probably have a much bigger impact, at least initially, on your beer. You don't have to go crazy on water chemistry and everything. We made beer for many, many years without knowing anything about mash pH. But once you're able to make good beer and you're able to make good beer consistently, then yeah, now I start worrying about some of these subtler things, like mash pH or adjusting my sulfate to chloride ratio or whatever. And those are really more advanced topics. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I mean, if I haven't asked anyone's questions yet, I might have missed them. If I did have it, apologize if you put them back in. I'll see them. But yeah, we've got a few questions about BeerSmith specifically. Are you okay? Are you okay to do that?
Of course.
Yeah, fine.
I'll try. Sometimes they're specific, so.
Yeah. So I've got here. So how often do items get updated? So the add-ons specifically, I guess. And the example given is obviously the new Lallemand Verdant yeast. I don't know if you've seen that over in the US, and it's just been launched here.
So I try and update them as often as I can. A lot of people don't know, a lot of the add-ons do get updated because I have manufacturers send me files and so on quite often. But I published a hop and yeast update just recently, which I think has all the latest hops in it. I think it's called Hop Update 2020 and Yeast Update 2020 as add-ons, and that was just done in the last couple of weeks. And I think I captured all the major manufacturers, Lallemand, White Labs, Y Yeast, et cetera, are in there. But I do try very hard to update those. I've even got a friend of mine who's helping me out doing a lot of those now to keep up to date with them, because there's constantly new malt producers coming out and yeast producers coming out. It's a challenge.
All right, thank you. And Alan asks, what is the most underutilized or unknown feature in BeerSmith that you think people need to know about?
There's so many little subtle things in there. Personally, I think the tools are underutilized. A lot of people don't know there's I don't know, like 16 tools there you can use that do all kinds of interesting things. Like you can adjust your mash temperature if it's off. You can adjust your gravity if it's off. You can, and these are just quick little calculators that you can use if you've got a problem. You can, weigh your keg and figure out how much beer's left in it. So there's all these little tools that are quite useful. Other than that, there's these subtle things like, a lot of us have two monitors now. You can, two computer monitors. You can do things like a lot of people don't know, if you hold down the shift key and double click on something, it'll actually open up a separate window. So you can compare 2 or 3 recipes side by side if you get the screen space. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of little tidbits like that. Here's another one. You can do math inside of any field. You can actually type a math expression into a field and it'll automatically convert when you hit the tab key. You can do the same thing with units. People don't even know that. So let's say I'm working in Celsius and somebody gives me the temperature in Fahrenheit. I can just type in 165 degrees F and put the F after it, and it'll convert it to Celsius if that's the one I'm working in. Or if I'm working in kilograms and, I want to do English units, you can do the same sort of thing. So there's a couple tips.
Yeah, no, there's a few things that I'm going to go play with. I never knew you could open up another window. I have multiple monitors here. So
yeah, I do. I can't even live without them anymore. I've got 6 right here on my desk. So
I've only got 4 in, but there you go.
Well, a lot of them are attached to different computers, so that's why I have. I got Macs and PCs and.
Yeah, that's good. So Darren asks, at what point did BeerSmith change from being something you used personally to a tool you thought other homebrewers could really use? I mean, was it something you started building for yourself, I guess?
So I did. Yeah, no, absolutely. I started building it in 2002, and originally it was just a tool I was going to use for myself. And but I enjoyed doing it, and so I just kept adding to it. And then I think it was October of 2003 is when I actually launched the first version. I did have a number of homebrewers help me, both local and some online. There was one guy in particular who was in Australia. I think his name was Steve. I forget his last name at the moment, but he actually contributed a lot. He had a lot of great ideas and just kept saying, "Oh, you ought to add this and you ought to add that." And so he helped me get a lot of those people helped me get the first version out in 2003, and then I think version 2 came out. It was really a hobby for many years. Sort of I'm making a couple $100 a month off of it kind of thing for many, many years. And then I think it was in 2008, I started doing a lot of the internet stuff, started doing a lot of writing and podcasting and all that stuff. And that really helped propel the business forward. And in 2010, I actually retired. And so now I'm out of my regular day jobs, and I've been doing this for 10 years, which is great. I feel very blessed to people make beer software for a living. I literally had people from my old job go. I had one of my bosses from my old job met up with him one day. He goes, "Hey Brad, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm making beer software." And he says, "No, what are you doing for a living?"
No, that's good. Thank you. Sorry, just trying to scan through here. Yes, so James asks, do you have any tips when is a good time to get into temperature controlled fermentation and getting the most from that setup? I mean, other than summer.
Well, I would argue there's things you can do up front that help maintain the temperature, even if you don't have a temperature control system. So for example, one of the tricks I used to use is, obviously you want to try and find a cool spot in your house that's dark. You don't want to, expose your beer to sunlight. Sunlight actually ruins beer pretty quickly. But you can do something simple like wrap your carboy or your bucket in a couple of wet towels. And as long as you keep wetting the towels and changing them out every 12 hours or so, you can actually drop the temperature of your fermenter by several degrees. And you can also stabilize it because it's not going to fluctuate as much because it's somewhat insulated by these wet towels as it would if you just let it sit out on its own. So, I mean, that's a good example of how you can do it on the cheap, if you will. Now, when you talk about actually spending money to get, temperature control system or a Keyser or they got these new fermenters that have, you can, I can't remember, I think SS Brewtech has one, you can run it through an ice bath or through a fridge or whatever. It's got a little coil and it'll pick up water. It actually cycles water through the system and control it. I mean, those are really, really nice and they are very useful. The time I'd probably really invest in something like that is particularly if you get interested in lagers, because you can make a lager without temperature control, but it's a lot harder, obviously. So I mean, I think that's important if you dive into the lager brewing. The other point I would guess is, it's a matter of how far you go into the hobby. It's, beer brewing is like anything else. You can spend whatever you want on it. So if you're a casual brewer who brews, every couple of months or brews during the winter or something, you probably don't need to spend $1 million on equipment. I for many, many years, all I had was a igloo cooler. In fact, until, I don't know, like 5 years ago, all I had was literally an igloo cooler. And I had a big pot and I had like a turkey burner a propane burner that I used to make beer. And I made great beer for years and years and years on that. But, you can spend what you want on it if you want to go out and buy a top-of-the-line Blickman system and a stainless steel fermenter and all this other stuff. And they have, the prices have come way down on those things. That's certainly something you can do. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think it's, when the hobby gets to the point where it's worth making that kind of an investment, that's probably when you're going to do it.
Oh, that makes sense. Antonio asks, are you thinking of adding a report to BeerSmith so you can print labels?
So some people have already done this. You can actually make custom reports in BeerSmith in HTML format. So if you have enough creative energy, you can, and people have done this and other people have done this, you can create label in HTML format. And then you can enter those as a custom report in BeerSmith. You just add them. There's actually under the options report section, there's a way to add the custom reports and you can print the labels out that way. So it is possible. I haven't gotten into the label making system myself just because I think it's a little bit more of a niche thing. Usually I made labels for some wine and mead I made, but I just did it in, Microsoft Word or whatever. I thought it was quicker, but I mean, you do have that option with the custom reports if you wanted to do it in the software.
Okay.
Other questions?
Well, Richard asked, what did you study for your PhD?
So a lot of people don't know this. I have a PhD in computer engineering. I actually have 5 degrees. So I have 3 master's degrees. I was a fellow at Draper Labs at MIT. I was a rocket scientist for many, many years. I worked in, I was actually in the Air Force. and I ran the space lab in Albuquerque called the Phillips Lab in Albuquerque. I was a director there for a number of years. So I launched satellites and did that for a long time. And this is my retirement job. So it's been great. I did that for 24 years, though. I did satellite space stuff, Air Force stuff for 24 years, and then decided to retire and do this. I want to do something different. Other questions? Did I lose everybody? No, I got you.
I think we lost Jerry for a second.
Yeah, I lost Jerry.
I don't want to keep you guys too long. I know it's getting.
No, we really appreciate you
Been an
taking
hour and a
the time
half.
and joining us, Brad. It's been absolutely fantastic.
I do appreciate you having me on, though. Thank you for your time, and thanks so many people for coming on and listening.
I think everyone thought when we announced it was quite a big draw for UK Homebrew Club to get you to join us, and I think
I'd be happy to do it again too. I got a bunch of presentations I can do. I have hours of stuff if there's anything you're interested, specific topics you're interested in. So.
Particularly Sarah, who's on the call, is in charge of the UK Homebrewing Association, so I think she might take you up on that offer.
Yeah, definitely. Would love to have you on to talk about something.
I'd be happy to. I've got talks on all kinds of stuff, hops and clarity and techniques and stuff. I'd be happy to talk.
Oh, that'd be fabulous. I'll drop you a mail.
Thank you for having me, though. I really do appreciate everybody coming on, and good luck with the rest of your meeting. I guess you guys are. I'm trying to think. You came up as Reading, is that right?
Yeah, so we're just outside of London.
Just west of the big city of London, right?
Yeah, exactly. About 30 miles.
Nice. Well, thank you again for having me. I hope you guys have a great evening.
Yeah.
And,
Well, yeah. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us. So yeah, apologies, I had a family interruption there. So, but yes,
no problem.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, and yeah, thanks.
Okay, I'm going to drop out and let you finish your meeting.
Yeah, no
You
worries.
got to do it.
Thank you very much. Thank
yeah,
you.
if everyone just
Thanks,
shows
Brad.
appreciation for Brad.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brad.
Yeah, thank you.
Saul.
Bye. Well, that
And
was good.
obviously,
All right.
thank you for arranging and getting in contact with Brad and pulling all that together.
I'll
Yeah.
stop recording now. By the way, just nobody.